Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have a remarkable event, which is a combination of two important things we have arranged for today. First of all, I am very much happy to introduce our colleague, our guest, distinguished ambassador Rае Квон Чунг, who is a member of the International Award Committee of the Global Energy Prize and director of the Environment and Development Division at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Mr. Chung is one of the most distinguished and outstanding experts in climate change and environmental policies. And he used to be a member of the international panel on climate change, which was awarded a Nobel Prize in 2007, along with Mr. Albert Gore. And Mr. Chung was a lead author in the report on technology transfer related to climate change and environment, so heavily contributing to this Nobel Prize award. And our second event, which is a follow-up to this one, is our graduation ceremony for our master students in our program on the governance of science, technology, and innovation. And then, in the and then we'll have an interim discussion between the lecture of Mr. Chung and the graduation ceremony about the future for our students and graduates. So, first of all, I'm glad to welcome Mr. Chung. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Leonid, for very kind introduction. It is a great pleasure for me to be able to find this opportunity. I just arrived at 3 a.m. in the morning in Moscow and from Copenhagen, and so it is really a great pleasure to see all of you, especially for the students who are specializing in the economics. I was also a student of economics. I studied economics in the university, and throughout my engagement in the climate change issues, as well as the sustainable development issues, I came to the conclusion that all the issues are related with economics, not only just environmental crisis. So unless we do something about the economics, which we are now learning and practicing actually, we may not be able to solve the problem we are facing now. So because of this, my personal conviction that economics has to be reformulated, otherwise it might be very difficult to address many of the environmental as well as the social problems we are facing now. Once upon a time when the old communist system like the Soviet Union was crumbling down, then many people thought it was the victory of the free market and the capitalism. But now, many people are coming up with a new argument and recommendations how to improve with the capitalism, which is now prevailing all over the world. It is true that we are living under an economic system of capitalism, which is based on the economic theory you are learning and you have been studying. But now this capitalism itself, to me, is a source of the problem of climate change itself. Unless we don't change the economic theory, I don't think we can resolve the climate crisis. Many people also think that we need money and technology to invest to solve the problem of climate change. That is true that we need money and technology. But what is more underlying reason and problem below the money and technology issue is the theory of economics. In other words, we are still living under the assumption of economic theory that water, air, and climate, or biodiversity, all these kind of things which are non-marketable things, actually not goods, but things, are just free goods. That's the assumption of economic theory. So we are treating air, water, biodiversity, climate as a free goods, which we can enjoy without paying any attention. So they are just externality. So economics has been treating them as externality. So economics has been mainly focusing on short-term supply and demand. Short-term supply and demand. It is mainly the subject of economic theory we are so far hearing a lot. There's a conventional economic theory. But conventional economic theory, I think it is not only me, but there are many other experts that are coming up with the argument that we need to improve the current capitalism. Otherwise, the social exclusion, social problem, as well as ecological problem cannot be resolved. So the issue is, how can we change the economic theory? I think that is not only my own argument, but also something we all have to work together for the future. So like a professor like Staritas and all of you who are studying economics has a very important mission that not only we are just following conventional economic theory, which to me is very much outdated. It can no longer, yes, it did some miracle of giving us a lot of goods and a lot of improvement in living standard. So we have improved a lot thanks to the free market theory, the short-term supply and demand, and also technological innovation. All these things have given us many kinds of wonders and miracles that enable us to enjoy the higher level of welfare and lifestyles. But now we're entering into a different stage where the conventional economic theory can no longer be valid or relevant. Of course, it will be continue to be relevant for short-term supply and demand issues. But the challenges we are facing now are long-term challenges. Climate change is a long-term challenge. Water, air, biodiversity, ecological crisis, all these crises, even social crises, are all long-term issues. It's not short-term supply and demand issue. But we have some mismatch of our thinking that we can solve this long-term social and environmental problem by relying only on free market theory and just capitalism theory. Then if we just leave it to the capitalism, it will solve all the problems of our issues. That has been some decades ago when, if I say so, when neoliberalism, which has been strongly promoted by President Reagan of the United States and also Margaret Thatcher of the UK, strongly pushed for neoliberalism and ideas where privatization and the free market can deliver all the wonders and it will solve all the problems. That has been the belief in those days in the 1990s. But now we realize that because of that neoliberalism, many of the problems we are experiencing right now is resulting from those neoliberal theory and, in other words, a kind of another ideology. So it is very important for all of us to realize that the economics itself is now entering into a new phase where it has to be reformulated to remain relevant for the challenge of our future, like climate change. Whenever I was a climate negotiator for a long time, since 91, so I have been spending so many hours negotiating in the negotiating room from 91. Sometimes I stayed all through the night, fighting each other, and even in Paris, even in Copenhagen, even in Bali. The negotiations were so difficult to agree. And the main reason, why is it so difficult to agree? Many people might wonder, what are the main reason, what are the main dilemma, why people are, governments, having such a difficulty in agreeing very simple agreement. The reason is very simple to me. It was simply because all the governments believe mitigation and climate action is detrimental and damaging to their economy. That is one reason. Everybody believes that climate action is a burden-sharing business. In other words, it's a painful work. So everybody is fighting each other to reduce their own pains, right? So they want to pass it to somebody else, minimize my own burden while passing it to somebody else. So it is a game of passing the burdens to each other. So I thought, when I joined the United Nations, I was a career diplomat of a Korean government. So my last job was a climate change ambassador for Korean government. But later I joined the United Nations and I promoted the idea of green economic growth. Because I thought, unless we change the perception that mitigation, emission reduction, and the climate action is actually not bad, but good for the economy. We have to change the perception. But still, we are bound by the perception that climate action is very bad for our economy. That's why all the governments are fighting each other to reduce their own burden. But I'm always asking, is it true? Climate action, is it bad for our economy? As an economist, you have 2 years of study. Is it 2 years of course, right? 2 years of economics study, right? Please use your own wisdom and intelligence. Is it going to be bad if we reduce our emission for our economy? And immediately after the Paris Climate Agreement was agreed, there are many kinds of different views on what will be the impact of Paris Climate Agreement for the future. Of course, there are positive views, but there are also very skeptic and negative views. One of the very interesting negative argument was from Bjorn Lomborg, argued that Paris Climate Agreement will cost $1 trillion to the global economy for the whole world, and it will be very costly, and the world economy will suffer, and it will be very destructive for the world economy. He released such kind of report, an argument, an article, and it has been circulated all over the world. Guardian and the Times and the Wall Street and New York Times, they all carried his article that Paris Climate Agreement will cost $1 trillion every year and it will destroy the world economy. That is a very interesting view from an economist. He is actually an economist and environmentalist. But if I can meet him, I would like to ask him. Unfortunately, so far I didn't have a chance to meet him, but if all the governments of the world are spending $1 trillion every year for climate action, after 30 years later, if they continue to spend $1 trillion every year, which means $30 trillion in 30 years, right? What will happen to our economy? According to his own argument, using some economic modeling, he argued that EU, European Union's GDP will be reduced by 1.6%. 1.6% by 2030. This is his argument. Based on what? A CGE model. Have you ever heard of a CGE model? Computable General Equilibrium model. Economists are still using that model, CGE model. And I think this CGE model is causing causing a lot of trouble and the source of the problem to me. Why? This CGE model is not capable of long-term projection to me. It is a general equilibrium model where there are some changes in certain part, then what will happen to the other part? This kind of equilibrium model. And it can only be relevant for maximum 3 to 5 years. It could be relevant. But I don't think this CGE model can be useful for 20, 30 years. Actually, no economists are capable of predicting what will happen to our world economy after 30 years. There's even no single economist in the whole world who can even predict what will be the impact of Brexit. We have now Brexit, right? Is there any economist who can predict what will be the impact of Brexit by next year? They are not capable of predicting 1 year later. But can they predict 30 years later what will happen to our world economy? It is a nonsense. It is a nonsense. We are suffering from very nonsensical projections using very simplistic economic models, only relevant for very short-term equilibrium. Actually, economics are short-term supply and demand equilibrium issue, right? Input and output equilibrium issue, mainly the traditional. But the business we are doing is 20, 30, 50 years of long-term challenges and projections. I strongly believe that this kind of short-term CGE models are not capable at all in projecting the impact of Paris Climate Agreement. But these economists are still coming up with such numbers like 1.6% minus GDP for European Union. Should we believe this? Not at all, to me. I don't believe it at all. But unfortunately, these stories are carried all over the world, and these stories are fixating the mindset of policymakers, business, and people. And they believe it. They believe it, unfortunately. But now we need different school of thinking based on long-term thinking. Actually, I tried it from 2004. I proposed the idea of green growth. Green growth means, I thought, if we invest in climate change, climate is like a green, is an environment. So if we invest in green, in the long run, we will have even higher economic growth. Higher economic growth. That is my argument. But actually, it is very difficult to prove because there's no modeling. And we are not capable of coming up with any modeling that can project 20, 30 years later. Are we capable of that? No, no human being is capable of projecting for it. But we can have, if we explore, empirical evidence of the past experience. If we look back, the past experience, what happened when we invest for human capital and the natural capital, what will happen is better that we should study empirical evidence of other countries in the past, rather than believing in very short-sighted economic modeling of a mainstream CG economic projections. I can tell you 1, 2 examples. For example, like Sweden, they introduced carbon tax in 1990. And many of the Nordic countries have a very high tax on energy. Very high tax on energy, like the European Union and others, Germany and Netherlands, Denmark. These countries have a very high tax rate on energy consumption. Then, what is the empirical evidence of this country? This country shows that their GDP grow, their economy didn't collapse because of the carbon tax, and they are maintaining the highest level of energy efficiency and also highest level of industrial competitiveness. Maybe you are reading from the world media, that internet, that when the World Economic Forum comes up with the World Competitiveness Index list, who are the #1 country in the world with the highest industrial competitiveness? It is always Sweden, Denmark, Germany. All these countries are highest level of industrial competitiveness. It is surprising that how come these countries having the highest level of energy taxes are enjoying highest level of industrial competitiveness, not to mention low level of CO2 emission. Their per capita CO2 emission is also low, but enjoying energy efficiency and level of technology, innovation is the highest in the world. So should we believe CG model, or should we believe empirical evidence of the countries that already tried carbon tax? But whenever we talk about carbon tax, we are always facing a strong opposition from many economists and also politicians that, oh, carbon tax will kill our economy. It's bad. There's a strong political resistance for carbon tax. So I'd like to emphasize the point that as an economist, we are all students of economics. But now, everybody is a student now because we are facing a new challenge, and the economic theory we have been learning so far cannot be no longer relevant for the long-term challenges we are facing. So we have to work together, and we have to exercise our collective wisdom, how to improve our capitalism or market economy. And I have a strong belief that in improving this economic theory and improving the capitalism and the market mechanism, what is most important point is that government has to play a very important role. Market will never improve on its own. Market will not deliver climate change actions or sustainable development goals. It cannot be delivered by market alone. In other words, we have to rebalance the role between public and private sector. Once we have some kind of pendulum, once we have a very strong government control, like a committee system, then we have another extreme where free market is another very extreme where no government, just market. Once we believe that will deliver everything to us. But now, after the financial crisis in 2008, we realized that that's not true. We can no longer believe that if everybody is pursuing their own greed, satisfying their own desire, then in the end, we will have higher level of welfare. That is Adam Smith's theory of invisible hand. So everybody should be allowed to pursue their own individual greed and desire. Then in the end, whole society will have a higher level of welfare through invisible hand. This is a very conventional theory, right? But now, 2008 has showed us that there's no invisible hand. When people go extremely greedy, and when we just leave it to the market alone, then what we found out is that market collapse. So we need now some kind of balance between public and private sector. That is the very critical role in balancing short-term and long-term goals. Of course, we have short-term goals as well. Short-term goals, job creation, and now everybody is concerned about job creation right now. So the argument, many of the argument for the economists was that we cannot, spare our money and time to invest for climate and for long-term sustainable development goals because we are busy and we have a very little money to invest for short-term priorities. This is why we cannot invest for long-term. That has been the mindset of everybody. But here, then everybody is asking where the money will be coming from to invest for long-term, right? Then I believe, it's not a matter of money and technology alone. It's a matter of how to set price signal between short-term and long-term. For example, I'll give you one example. You are the students of a master school. Until after master school, you have been studying how many years? You studied 6 years of elementary school, 6 years of middle high school, so 12 years already. 4 years of university, 16 years. Now 2 years of master, 18 years, right? So you have been investing 18 years for your education. So in other words, you have been investing for 18 years. The reason why you are investing 18 years for your education, because you know that after 18 years of investment in your education, then you will have a much higher welfare than just having 6 years of elementary school and going to the work, and then you will have a lower level of welfare. That is your expectation. That's why you are investing for 18 years. So it has been. Also, many people are talking about, I'm from Korea and Korean economic development. But the success to me, I have been going through Korea's economic development processes. From when I was young, Korea was so poor, and now the main reason was very simple. Korean people invested in their children's education. They sacrificed their household incomes and they spent it for their education, for their children. And so that has been the success, the ingredient or key for the economic development of Korea's success story. Likewise, same thing to me. The same logic can be applied in solving the problem, not only education, but also climate change and many other issues. Water, energy, biodiversity. If we invest in long term, then not only we are solving the climate crisis only, but also at the same time, we will have an even higher economic return. We have some empirical evidences from, as I said, the Nordic countries and some other countries in European examples. So my argument is that we need to change our perception mindset that investing in green can deliver even higher economic growth in the long run. Then the challenge is, how can we close the time gap between short term and the long term? As I said, governments, people, business, they all have a very short term challenges. That's true. All governments have short term challenges. Welfare spending every year. But how can we balance the long term and short term challenge? I think the simple tool, policy option to do that is changing our tax system. The tax system. We have to change our tax. For example, we have to increase tax on energy and recycle that money to invest in renewable energy and technological innovation. Then, in the long run, we will have a higher economic development. I will tell you a success story. Many people, when I say this kind of thing, many people are thinking that, oh, it's like a fairy tale. It's unrealistic. It's like a dream. But there are some countries with a real story. Costa Rica is a country, now as you know, what Costa Rica looks like, right? It's a country of ecotourism. It's a green, Costa Rica is covered with forestry. So we know what Costa Rica is, we know it, we heard about it. I was surprised to learn that Costa Rica suffered deforestation. Their forestry coverage was down to up to 20%. So most of the mountains of Costa Rica was completely deforested to increase their ranch, dairy farms, to raise cattle and to sell beef, all this mass production of ranches and the beef production. So they destroyed their forestry. Then about 20, 30 years ago, from 1980, they started to introduce tax on those ranch farmers who are dairy owners for cutting down the forest, and also increase tax on the energy for fossil fuel consumption. And then they recycle that revenue for reforestation. And they did it for 30 years. Now their forestry coverage is almost 70, 80%. So it has been done through a very long-term schedule and planning and investment. Now in Costa Rica, they declared they will no longer do mining. They say, we will close down all mine, we will keep our forestry, and the number one industry there is ecotourism, and ecotourism has been actually high value added returns for many of the people, so they find a lot of jobs. It's socially very inclusive, as well as environmentally very sustainable. So this is a very interesting success story from a developing country, not only from developed country, and also from Denmark. I came to Moscow last night from Copenhagen. It's a very shocking experience to me that to see how many people are riding bicycle. And in the downtown of Copenhagen, even during the rush hours, there's almost no traffic congestion. Very few cars are running around. It's a very interesting experiment. And this kind of thing didn't happen overnight. And especially the Danish success story of Vestas. Vestas is a wind turbine company. Maybe some of you might know. And Vestas was actually using the technological innovation, as was explained by Professor Leonid earlier. I was a lead also for technology transfer report of IPCC. I was focusing on the technological innovations of Denmark on wind turbine. This wind turbine innovation initially supported by government. So it's government R&D projects from 1970, after the oil crisis in 74. Danish government set a long-term goal for energy independence. And then they pursued it for 30, 40 years. And then they invested it for wind technology. And by 1990, when their wind turbine technology becomes stabilized, they set up a company. They commercialized the technology. And the company was supported by government with some private fund. They set up Vestas company, which was the only company at that time in the world, because government invested in wind turbine technology. So it's a blue ocean. Then when wind turbine market grew, then Vestas was enjoying the number one monopoly of the wind turbine technology. And at one point, the export of Vestas was almost 1.5% of Danish export. They were so successful. So this is a story of investing for a long term, and then the reward was so high, and that they enjoyed so much return. Of course, right now, Vestas' share of wind turbine market is going down and down. There are many competitors are coming in, joining, but it was Vestas was the innovator, and they enjoyed the blue ocean. So this is an example of green growth. My argument of green growth. If we continue to invest in green, in the long run, we can enjoy higher economic return. So my argument is that when we argue to the people or government that, we have to do this to protect climate change, then they say that, we have a more important business than climate change. Climate change is something we can wait. That is always the reaction from many of the policymakers. But that's why I changed the story. I changed the story that, no, my story is different. If we invest in climate action, we will have more jobs, and we will have a more market, technology, and even higher GDP. Then the policymakers are interested to listen. Is it so? Is it true? So now what I want to say is that we should work together to change the storyline that when we invest in green, in the long run, we will have a higher economic growth. I disagree with the argument of Mr. Romberg. The EU will suffer 1.6% GDP loss if EU go for a Paris climate agreement. So I'd like to have some kind of a betting between Mr. Romberg and myself whether really EU's GDP will be reduced by 1.6% by 2030. Will it be true? So, we'll wait. I hope I could be alive by that time and see whether European Union's economic GDP will be reduced 1.6% by that time. So this is an example. I'm saying this to show you that the conventional economic theory is now showing its own limits. And we now have to improve on economic theory. And it is a territory nobody yet ever explored. It is a new territory. So nobody is an expert, and everybody has to work together for this new territory. And one last point I would like to highlight is that the issue of closing the time gap between short-term and long-term, fiscal policy is the key. We have to change the tax system. Without changing the tax system, without changing the price for fossil fuel, it is impossible to transform towards a renewable energy economy or low carbon future. We are talking about low carbon future, but without changing the price signal for the carbon, it is almost impossible that we can move towards a low carbon. Then many people, I already said, many people are arguing that, tax on carbon will damage our economy. But my argument is that, no, carbon tax will deliver even higher economic growth and jobs. So I'm actually thinking of doing some research work on modeling, economic modeling. If we introduce a carbon tax, what will happen to our economic growth by 2030? My assumption is it will trigger technological innovation, R&D, and create a new market and new product, and then it will create more jobs, and then it will stimulate even more economic growth. This is a very different way of thinking than, carbon tax will kill our economy. Because many people think like that because they are only thinking about the short term, very short term. It might be true. In the short run, there might be some negative impact on the economy. But in the long run, it will not be negative. It can be even positive, a lot more positive. It is not only my argument. Actually, it is the argument of the business people. You might know the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, WBCSD. Last year, they officially said that we are willing to accept the carbon tax. The business said that, not me. The business said that. Because business said carbon tax is not an issue for them because what business doesn't like is an uncertainty. They don't like uncertainty. But if a government make it clear that, we will increase carbon tax 1% every year. so that the tax rate will go up and up and up very gradually up to 2030. Then business will adjust their investment schedule. And then they can observe and then they can use it. What they want is a certainty and removal of uncertainty. Then business has sufficient capacity to adapt to new price signal. It's not my comment, but it is the argument of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. The businessmen themselves, they are calling for carbon tax, but politicians are afraid of it. But my last point is that, as I said earlier, in order to do this, we need a more stronger role by the public sector. In other words, government has to play a more important role in transforming towards a low carbon future or sustainable development goals. Then in that sense, I think Russia is in a better situation than like a Korea or United States. Why? In those countries, government is already too weak. Too weak. They cannot, even in Korea, Korean government cannot introduce any kind of environmental regulation. Strong resistance from the business and the people. It's almost too much democratized, in other words, to me. People are also too much focusing on the self-interest. They are voting for their politicians, and the politicians are only interested in getting the voting. So they don't have any reason to promise something for 2030. They only care about their own office only for 2 to 3 years. This is the dilemma of a democratic system itself. So I think that once upon a time, Francis Fukuyama, the American historian, wrote a book, End of History, right? You might know that, End of History. He said that capitalism and democracy is the end point of the evolution of human history. But now we realize that it is not at all the ending point. Now we have to improve on democracy, because this democracy itself, to me, is showing very clear limits. Because as you can see now in American electronic election news, that people are, the politicians are promising only short-term promises. They don't talk about long-term issues at all, because it is not popular. So this democracy, purely based on populism, I don't know whether they can really meet the challenge of long-term problems. So now democracy and the capitalism as well, which is mainly focused on short-termism, cannot. Now we are standing for beginning point where how we can improve the democratic system and the capitalism. And in that sense, I think newcomers like Russia, in the sense of capitalism or democratic system, I think you can think about not just copying the Western system, but Western capitalism or Western democratic system, but we can think about how can improve. These systems can work for a long term. I think the strong role by the government or public sector's role can be a kind of a benefit and advantage of moving towards a new system, I believe. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very rich. Yes, thank you very much for this very rich and I would say in some instances very provocative lecture, which really puts a whole series of various questions and challenges, not only the, as you said, conventional economic theories, but also the way it is taught at universities and elsewhere. So first, I suggest we ask questions. Please.
Hello, my name is Juldis. I'm a student. Kwan Chung professor, what do you think about project management for sustainable development in Russia? Project management for sustainable development in Russia country. Yeah.
The status of sustainable development?
Yes.
In Russia?
Yes, sustainable development. Project management for sustainable development in a big Russian company.
Actually, I'm not familiar with the policies here, but I think the Russian government or Russian people, in a very fortunate, well-endowed situation where you have a very rich natural environment, natural resources, and I have been flying over this country, huge country, or some part of it from Ural Mountains, Ekaterinburg to Moscow and to St. Petersburg. It's completely green. And of course, the other, of course, in Siberia, also green. So you have a huge base of natural resources as well as a natural ecosystem where it can be a very important basis for sustainable development. But I think the future will depend on what kind of policy strategy, whether it is mainly on short-term maximization of output, or in other words, GDP and production, or can there be some long-term balance, short-term and long-term balance, so that Russia can balance the maintaining long-term sustainable development, in other words, ecosystem, climate, and the biodiversity. So these two, it depends on, I think it depends on your strategy, because now still Russia is in an early stage of a full industrial, in other words, in terms of a marketization of commercial consumerism or marketing businesses. If you have a proper balancing between long-term and short-term issues, I think Russia is in a more balanced situation to pursue the sustainable development than any other country in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions, please. George, what about opportunity thinking? I don't see it. Sorry. Alexander, please.
First of all, dear Professor Chun, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting. My question is about the following. You mentioned that when you mentioned Russia, you thought that the government here in my country has much greater opportunities to introduce sustainable development measures much easier than in the United States or in your country. But what about the largest world economy now, China? I mean that it has very strong government on the one hand, but on the other hand, the environment in China is just awful. When you visit them, you see that you cannot see you cannot see sun during weeks in Beijing. My question is, what do you think about the sustainable development of this country? Thank you.
I think you mentioned about Chinese case, right?
Yes.
Yeah. The case of China is also very interesting. Many people are pointing that China is now suffering terrible air pollution because of the economic development. And how can China pursue a sustainable development in the future? But my interpretation is the current air pollution issue in China, in a way, is a result of the very rapid industrialization and the development during last 2 decades based on very cheap fossil fuel, because their production base was constructed in a way that using a lot of very cheap fossil fuel, and that the energy system is also using dirty coals. This has been the system of the past. But now China is trying very hard to move away from the dirty outcome from those processes. So Chinese are now, as you know, #1 investor in renewable energy, photovoltaic, and all these solar cells. So China, in other words, also there are many positive sides as well. So it will take some time, but Chinese government is exercising a very strong leadership. For example, in promoting solar panels in remote areas, they are installing the largest number of solar panels in the world, and this is not possible if the government exercises a strong leadership. So it is possible only because of that. So I believe the Chinese government is exercising, and they know very well, they are very well aware about these issues, and my conviction is that they will very quickly move away from this dirty heritage from the fast industrialization, and they will make, I believe, in the future, maybe one of the most very fast improvement in the whole world. And that is my expectation, because the current situation could be very temporary, but it can go on maybe 3, 4, 5 years. But after that, I think China will see the end of that very dirty tunnel of those air pollution situation, but they will move very fast, quickly, thanks to Chinese government very strong leadership. So I think this can be some kind of a very interesting lesson for maybe Russian government can study about the Chinese experience. So maybe you can avoid repeating the same mistake of using fossil fuel only if you look at these results. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. The last question, Professor Dürkmeister, please.
Probably more a comment than one question. It's very nice when you talk about the international treaties, climate change, or Paris, Kyoto, and whatsoever. The only problem I see is every country signs the treaty, no country ratifies the treaty. So it's not legal, it's not law in no countries, especially in the big usual suspects like the Chinese, the Americans, the Canadians, and these issues. But I believe the underlying cause for the disaster is probably based in our mentality and based in our school system even already. From the first day in school on, we teach our kids cash, 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 money, money, money. Makes the word go around. When the best kids were going to a business school, they're not studying natural science, they don't understand what the world is about. What they want to understand is quarterly figures, quarterly two-digit profits, growth rates, and that's what the Wall Street is about. Now, in that moment, we have a contradiction between policy and economy, like especially the stock exchanges, the capital, the financial markets, who infiltrate and who lobby strongly in the political arena. And when we see the people exchanging, moving, and kind of diffusion between the two systems, but we have no more leadership at all anywhere, not a single country where we could argue and state there's a person telling us what to do and where to go in the future. But how do we solve that contradiction eventually? How do we get people motivated, educated, and trained in a sense that we are a little bit more sustainable and getting away from the two-digit growth and return on investment within hours thinking? I think that is the underlying problem. We don't need Paris climate change agreement and treaty stuff like that. Everybody's making fun of it because they say, it's nice paper, so what? Next treaty comes in 5 years' time in Montreal or wherever. So that's the big challenge. So how do we approach that?
My comment is that, yeah, I agree with you, that's the situation. And then that's why, as you said, the Paris Climate Agreement is not legally binding. It is just voluntary, INDC. NDC means each country just offer whatever they can do. And they just review. That's it, every 5 years. So under this climate system, how can we expect the world can deliver the real climate actions? That's true. That's why I don't think we can rely on any global agreement to deliver climate actions. I strongly believe we better come up with a new economic theory and economics thinking that climate action is a driver of our economic growth. Unless we change our perception like that, people still think that climate action is bad for my economy, then they will never do it. So what is very critical is that somehow we need to prove that by investing in climate, some country enjoy higher economic growth and more jobs. So we need to create such kind of model. Otherwise, people will not believe that. So, because also mainstream or conventional economists keep on coming up with the negative messages. So we badly need a success story where investing in climate action can really benefit the economic growth. And so we need to change the perception. So this new, which is a green growth idea, it was what I was arguing. So unless we prove that green growth can happen and possible, then I think it's difficult. We cannot rely on just an agreement to deliver the climate action. So that's why the job of all of us around this hall and table is very important, that we need to prove green growth or low carbon growth is possible, or it can even deliver us even more good jobs and higher welfare, and that kind of thing is very badly needed, and we have to work together for that, I think. Otherwise, it's very difficult to change all these metrics.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chung. So I suggest now that we make a break for about 5 to 10 minutes, because there is a TV who would like to take an interview with you, and then we get back here, and Ocean will continue with the next stage of our program. Thank you very much.